We all took out our flashlights. Ed brought out his camera. It was quiet and it was darked out. The snow was not falling as hard, but that meant the fog was going to set in. "What is that?" Jake asked quietly. He was pointing over towards Building 4. I couldn't see it well, but I counted what looked like 7 figures with 7 small glowing lights walking through the trees in a single file line. I am assuming they were holding candles, and I am assuming that they are coming from Building 4. It is about 3:40 p.m. I would not expect them to be out at this time. I guess it was dark and foggy enough for them to feel covered. We stood still and watched the large owl break our view of the robed figures. It flew across the property and landed on the top pole of a swing set. Once again the owl was facing us. We hopped the fence and made our way towards Building 3. We had to take another wood panel off one of the windows. Snow had piled up enough to block our first entrance. Once we made it inside, it became obvious that the ambient energy of the rooms didn't feel right. It didn't feel right at all. It felt very different than last time. Everything had emotion. Everything I looked at or touched, I felt something heavy and different from the rest. The hallways, the rooms. They all felt different. We went in rooms we haven't gone in yet. We found cassette tapes. We found a handheld recorder. The pictures were different. I'm not saying they had a different meaning. I am saying the pictures in this building are all completely fucking different. We made our way into the main hall. The painting of the sun, a human's face, was one of the only paintings or portraits that stayed the same. We were curious to see if the bishop's photo was still there, so we walked into the main gathering room with the many couches and large fireplace. We all walked up to the fireplace and shined our light on the frame. His eyes were different. It looks like Bishop Turner was crying a dark fluid. Somehow a small pool of it had accumulated on the floor in front of the fireplace. I took out the spirit box and attached it to the speaker. The moment I turned it on, faint yelling could be heard down the hall. Many voices could be heard echoing through the rooms. Jake Bird-I-Gome ring bringa and cement till solens descendenter. Stop. No. No. Stop. Leave. Run. "You must descend, my friends," said a high raspy voice. Sounded like a guy, but I couldn't tell. "Why must we descend?" I asked.
"What is down?"
"Who is this?" I asked.
"Jim."
I remember what Blanca said about that name. After a few moments of white noise, the sound of breathing could be heard coming from the speaker. It did not sound like a person. It was too heavy, it was too deep. It sounded like someone held up the microphone to a bison's nostril.
"Best tam dag for na Denver. Descend to thee,"
said a rough voice that had 2 tones. The voice phased into the voice of a male child, then began to laugh slowly.
"Do Molly's Familie men. You must read."
I felt someone hold my hand. I knew once again. This was not Ashton. More people could be heard yelling and screaming. A different voice came in a few seconds later. "Gone Ed. Gone Ed. Gone Ed. Gone Ed. Gone Ed." The box turned off abruptly. "What the fuck is going on, man?" Jake said aloud, sounding terrified. "What language is that?" "It sounds Danish," Kendall asked. "I thought so too, but it is actually Norwegian," Ed replied. "What did they ever do with the bishop's body?" "I forgot what we read," I asked. "The article said they fed on him for days until authorities came. They broke every bone in his body, and while he was still alive, they tore off his fingers and toes. Then they tore off his hands and feet. Eventually they ate everything but his head and parts of his torso. The authorities found the torso but the head was never found. In another article, I read that the children took the head and buried it in the ground. They then poured water in the hole so it would be frozen solid and preserved for centuries. Ed responded as he finished changing out the batteries on the spirit box. How true do you think that is? Kendall asked. Well, they haven't found the head yet, have they? Ed responded before zipping up his backpack. After a few more moments, we began to hear periodic tapping coming from the room over. Soon after, a door shut on the second floor. We were timid at first, but after about 10 more minutes in the building, we began to feel a little more comfortable. We went upstairs and found some more pictures and drawings. We were on the first floor when we turned down one of the hallways to see that one of the light bulbs mounted on the wall was emitting a low-voltage yellow glow. It would dim in and out, getting brighter and then darker again. We slowly approached the light, all puzzled why it was on. There was no power to any of these buildings and there hasn't been for years. We got to the point where we were right next to it when the bulb went from a low glow to an almost white bright light. The bulb illuminated the whole hallway for about 5 seconds before bursting. A loud pop echoed down the hall. Fuck, man. Fuck. It got my face. I think I cut my face, said Ed, holding his cheek below his left eye. A shard of glass cut him open right underneath the eye. About a 2-inch gash that was bleeding pretty good. Let's get out of the room, Jake said, looking at all of us. One by one we all began walking out the hall and into the room that had our exit window. We quickly made it through the snow and over to Jake's Jeep. We all piled in and turned the engine on. We turned off the headlights and turned on the cab lights. Ed did what he could to dress his face while the rest of us all tried to calm down. After around 10 minutes of talking, we all agreed to put on the Jerry Show and relax for a bit. We will take a break then see how we feel. I opened my backpack and reached in to grab one of the cassette tapes we found on the floor. I gave the tape to Kendall to put in the player. It was labeled Building 3, Floor 1 Left Wing, December 29, 1973. It was a recording from an interview the investigators had with some of the children on the ward in Building 3. Hello Scarlett, my name is Robert. I'm going to ask you a few questions, okay? If you have trouble understanding what I'm saying, ask me to repeat it, okay? Okay, said a soft female voice. Her responses were broken. It's apparent she was having trouble speaking. How old are you, Scarlett? The man asked. 12. Can you tell me what happened a few nights ago, Scarlett? With the bishop? The man asked. I didn't do it. He did it. I didn't do it. He was like that when I seen him there. The girl replied. Where? The fireplace. She stated. What did you see? Can you tell me what you saw when you woke up? You're not in trouble, dear. Just tell me the story. The man said softly. My friends, because they are my friends, while Jeffrey was hitting the bishop. Scarlett replied. With what, dear? They had Bishop's leg. Was his leg on or off his body? The man asked. His leg was off of his body, all his legs, all his arms were off of his body. He was hitting him with one of his legs. What happened after that, Scarlett? The man asked. More of my friends came into the room and then what happened? He tasted like pennies, Scarlett responded. He tasted like pennies? The investigator asked, seemingly shocked. Thomas buried his head. She replied before the tape was cut short by another interview. It was a boy around 6. He admitted that the bishop would come into his room and give him candy if he got naked. If he didn't, he would be disciplined the following day, which involved being tied to the bed while people he didn't know would take turns having sex with him. The next interview was a boy named Tucker, then a girl named Jackie. Every child told a story of horror surrounding Bishop Turner. The investigators briefly talked about Jacob after they had recorded themselves walking into his room. They explained that Jacob took his life the morning that the bishop was murdered. They read a note they found on his bed aloud for the recorder. The man began. I am so sorry to my mommy. I am so sorry if you decided to have a son after me. The things my father prayed to are now the same things our bishop prays to. I do not want to hurt here. I do not want to be here. I do not want to see him anymore. I am sorry, Mommy. I am sorry to whoever finds me. I love you. The man continued talking into his recorder while going room to room. I looked over to see a tear running down Ashton's face. I gave the rest of the cassettes to Ed, Jake and Kendall sat and listened to interview after interview of children describing what they saw happen to Bishop Turner, as well as confessions about the sexual acts he performed in the rooms. From 4 years old to 72 years of old. Confession after confession. I fucking hate him, I fucking wish him the absolute worst. If I were alive back then I would stomp his pathetic face out too. Jake said, holding back tears. What a sad, pathetic piece of shit, Kendall added. I don't give a fuck what is whispering in your ear. Like Blanca said, his soul was not touched by the below yet. He made every decision well aware of what he was doing. It added. Fuck him, man. Fuck his soul. Jake said, lighting a cigarette. I lit a cigarette as well and took out Mr. Bringston's journal. I reached back in to grab the medical files I got from the house. Ashton read the files while I went through the journal. I did the best I could to read as quickly as I could. It began around the same time as Mrs. Bringston's. In almost the same format. Mr. B was happy that his wife was pregnant. He expressed excitement for the boy to be born. He was a very religious man. Mr. and Mrs. B adhered to every tradition the Catholic Church of Northridge spoke of. Mr. Bringston claims that when he prayed at night, he stated he without a doubt knew someone was listening. He also stated that someone would answer back. He developed a relationship with the one he was talking to. He often recited their conversations in his entries. He was told he would have the most beautiful of children. Intelligent, funny, handsome, and many others were all things that were promised as long as he fulfills the favors of the Holy Spirit. He did talk very briefly in 1960s of how fond he was of Bishop Turner. Described him as a pure soul and a praise spirit. He grew close with the bishop after years of the ceremony. Once Jacob was born, Mr. B felt there was something wrong with his child. He did not like the way the boy looked, he did not like the way the boy cried when held by him. He despised the boy to his very core and prayed death upon Jacob every night at his bedside. He wrote on multiple occasions that God had failed him and that he must try again. The conversations he was having with his said Holy Spirit were getting more and more cryptic. Just like the bishop, Mr. Bringston was not talking to the below yet. He was speaking with a religious spirit that was not led into heaven. He wrote that the spirit that was answering his prayers had told him that sometimes in order to gain recognition from God, you must prove yourself. Mr. Bringston started to express hatred and disgust towards his wife. He blamed her for creating a monster. There were no visible signs that Jacob was special needs at all, but the voice that answered Mr. B convinced him otherwise. The hatred grew stronger and stronger. He became angry with God along with everyone around him. He would curse the one he prayed to. He would wander into the night and argue with the one responding. He really felt he was talking to a decibel of God. He never knew this terrible bitter spirit had him by the finger. The spirit told him that he's been unfaithful, and to achieve a spawn of perfection he must obey the voice at all cost. He built the shack the year after Jacob was born. The things that took place inside that shack were guided by the answers to his nightly prayers. After years of feeling hopeless and lost, he sought out Bishop Turner for guidance. The bishop who had just opened the institution a couple of years prior. Mr. Bringston saw this as an opportunity to rid himself of his son Jacob. It didn't take much time before Bishop Turner agreed to house Jacob into adulthood and rid the Bringstons of their impurities. Mr. B went home and told his wife that if she did not agree to hand over Jacob to the bishop, then he would take the boy's life in the backyard after 24 hours. The morning after, they took that picture in front of Willow Creek Institution. After Jacob was gone, Mrs. Bringston suffered a deep, lonely manic depression. She stopped going to church and was resilient of her husband. But with a new look on life and with a clean slate, Mr. Bringston was eager to try again. He began to pray again to desperately show his devotion to his God. He had done everything he had been told, he was in high spirits he would finally have a perfect boy. One night in 1973 a voice answered once again. This time the voice was different, the conversations were different. Mr. Bringston began to sleepwalk. He would often wake up in the shack he built or in the woods behind the home. One night in January of 1973, he walked 7 miles down the streets late at night until he reached a break in the trees. He had been sleepwalking the entire time. He had walked for hours, his feet were bleeding from the rocks. He wrote that when he woke up he spent a few minutes on a park bench before he was approached by a man named Jim. He was confused about how anyone found him in the middle of the forest. After some conversation the man became aware of Mr. Bringston's situation. The man told him that he will be relieved of all sin and promised a new healthy baby boy if he had permission from the father to take his first son's life. Knowing that Mr. Bringston did not care about Jacob, he swore to the deal. The man also said that if Jacob takes his life, before the man could find him, then that Mr. Bishop would be in the hands of the below. His bloodline would be cursed and his spirit would suffer until the end of time. Not truly knowing what that meant, Mr. Bringston swore a deal to that as well. In the following months, Mr. B started showing signs of his old self. After a night out and a few bottles of wine, Mrs. B and Mr. B fucked for the first time in years. 4 months after handing over Jacob, they found out they were pregnant with their next child. In December of 1973, a baby boy was born. He wrote the same day that he had found out that his son Jacob had died while at Willow Creek. His son Jacob took his life in his closet. The next page was a suicide note. He talked about how in the end he got what he wanted, but it would mean nothing once he achieved it. He got his baby boy and blew his brains out the day he was born. The last picture he drew was a sun with a Renaissance face. It answered the question that the first great king found Mr. Bringston that night. The tapes were still playing, everyone was still fixed on the interviews. Ashton tapped me on the shoulder, then put the medical files in my hands. "Switch me, baby," Ashton said as I grabbed the folder. From losing Jacob to watching her husband kill himself as well as everything in between. You could imagine the trauma and the toll the events took on Mrs. Bringston. She was nowhere near mentally capable of raising a child. The boy was often found to wear diapers that were days old. The boy was showered maybe once a week and the food he was given would give the boy severe stomach issues to the point where neighbors notified CPS. Mrs. Bringston had the boy for 3 years before having to surrender custody to her parents, Jeff and Pam Alamos. I quickly looked to the front of the folder to find a hospital face sheet that read, "Joyce Alamos. Born June 21, 1923. The voice of the investigator played as I stared at the headrest in front of me. Ashton's hand reached for mine. "I wanted you to read that on your own, my love. Take your time, I'm right here," she said, kissing my hand. I had no words, I was numb. My thoughts became cloudy, my eyes began to water. After a few minutes, I looked over at Ashton. "I do not know what to say," I stated softly before wiping the tears from my face. "We have to tell them, my love, it's only right they know," she said softly before kissing my hand again. "Not right now, we will tell them everything soon." "I really need to process this before we talk about it," I responded, trying not to be hurt. "Whatever you feel is right, we will get through this one together, okay? I support whatever you want to do with this," Ashton replied. We held back tears as we sat and listened to another set of interviews. About halfway through the tape I noticed a glow-like flicker from one of the missing window panels. It was Building 4. Kendall turned the volume down after we all noticed it. Jake and Kendall both looked back at the three of us. "What are we thinking, gang?" Jake said aloud. We all took a vote, 4-1. The night was not yet over. We agreed to go back inside Building 4, but we are going to leave right after that. I got out and threw my backpack around my shoulder. Ashton walked over to my side of the Jeep. I could tell how worried she was about me. "I love you, Forrest, okay? I love you," she said as she wrapped her arms around my body. "This is fucked, baby, this is really fucked," I replied, fighting back more tears. "Listen, baby, you are okay, we are okay. No one could be prepared for something like that, Forrest, not even you," she said as she pulled off of me. "I don't want to believe it, I am not going to believe it," I said, wiping my face. "I know, baby, and we don't have to right now," Ashton said, pulling 2 cigarettes out of her pack. She kissed my lips and handed me a cigarette. Ashton grabbed my hand and rubbed her thumb back and forth against mine. We walked over to the group who were looking over at the window trying to see if the glow would come back. We changed out our batteries and started walking over to Building 4. The fog was growing thicker, the snow had stopped as well as the wind. The glow from the moon barely made its way through the clouds. The thick snow blanketed the walkway up to the entrance. Once inside, all 5 of us were silent. There was almost no ambience. Immediately we were hit by an aroma that made all of us nauseous. The smell was indescribable. Ashton and Ed were gagging once they made their way in. The rooms and halls were pitch dark. The only lights were from our flashlights. Without our light, We could not see our hands in front of our faces. After some time inside, Ed was the first to notice that every picture on the wall in this building was reversed. Every photo was a mirrored image from the last time we saw them. My stomach sank to the floor. The air grew colder and colder. I don't think I have ever felt a feeling so unsettling in my life. This did not feel right. Every ounce of me wanted to go back to the Jeep. All 5 of us covered our mouths with our jackets so we wouldn't get sick from the smell and continued through the building. After passing a couple of rooms, we began to hear low humming coming from the floor above us. They got louder as we approached the base of the staircase. We went into the large room next to the cafeteria. There was a large painting of a sun that took up one entire wall. We all stood in the doorway looking down the hall. We could see a glow coming from under the cafeteria doors. We all slowly walked down the hall and into the cafeteria room. The room was lit by candles that emitted a reddish-orange glow. We all shined our flashlights on the far end of the room where a group of candles were lit. We all walked slowly through the row of tables and over to a large fixture. There was blood and candle wax all over the floor. The room smelt of smoke and black mold. Something was rotting. Footprints, paw prints, antlers, fur, all lined the floor of the hall. On the ground, surrounded by a large circle of candles, lay 15 legs in 2 rows. They all had different skin tones and looked as if they belonged to 15 separate people and not just pairs. On the ground above the severed legs were 7 lower jaw bones that must have been broken off of someone's face. The jaw bones still had teeth and flesh still attached. The legs and mandibles were all in various stages of decomposing. Some bloated, some just boned out. I brought my light about a foot above the body parts to find a large pile of branches and sticks. On top of the pile was the head of Bishop Turner, impaled on a long branch. His head was facing the 5 of us. A large crown of sticks had been placed on top of his head. A foot to the left of the bishop's head was the head of a large toad, also impaled on a long stick. To the right was the head of a cat. The same cat that has been visiting our house. We all stood frozen, all not sure what to do. We all kept our lights on the heads in front of us, still trying to cover our mouths. On the wall behind the fixer were posters glued to the wall. When I had a chance to look closer, I saw that they were all missing posters. Lily Howarth, James Timland, Thomas Sultan, Alison Ralkin, Olivia Benet, Nathan Jefferson, Kylie Braxton, Jonathan Grady, Elliot Evans, and Franklin Wadsworth. These body parts belong to the missing cases we keep seeing on the news. We all began to hear humming from the hallway again. This time a lot closer. The spirit box suddenly turned back on and began scanning through white noise, getting louder and louder. I took off my bag as fast as I could to turn off the box.
I found you.
We were all fixed on the bishop's face. His eyes slowly began to open. Once we all saw that, we knew it was time to leave. We turned around and for the first time saw the rest of the room. The candles on the walls got brighter and were able to illuminate the mangled carcasses that blanketed the floors around us. "We have to go, man," Jake said aloud. Without thinking twice, he began stepping over the mangled bodies and rushing over to the door that leads to the hallway, leaving us to desperately follow. As we ran after Jake, we could hear more yelling, screaming coming from the rooms we were passing. It took a while to find our way outside. Once we were out of the building, we all looked ahead to see that Jake was still running. Not toward the Jeep, but towards the tree line. It was far too cold for any of us to yell and he had his keys. The only thing we could do is chase him through the forest, and it's obvious he was not stopping. The 4 of us ran into the tree lehau and followed him for what felt like at least 10 minutes. Once we caught up to him, we had to tackle him to get him to stop. "What the fuck, man? We need to get back to your Jeep." "What the fuck are you doing, Jake?" Ed said, trying to catch his breath. "I'm sorry. I'm fucking sorry. I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Jake seemed completely disoriented. He was panicking and not acting like himself at all. None of us have ever seen him like this before. He was like this for a few more minutes until he finally caught his breath. Kendall began sobbing while Jake held her. He scared her, he scared all of us. Ed began flipping through pages in his notebook. I held Ashton as she began to sob as well. It took us about a few moments to gather ourselves, We all seemed numb from what we walked into. Ed brought out a bottle of whiskey from his backpack. "Let's all try and calm down. I know that shit is in the front of all of our minds, trust me it is for me too, but we need to regroup. It is -10 degrees right now, I'm assuming we are about half a mile from the tree line. I'm sure I can get us out of here, but we have to stay focused. We need to survive now and grieve later," he said, passing the bottle over to Kendall. We all knew he had a good point. The snow was starting to come down harder, the wind howled through the trees. The clouds passed over the trail making it darker than before. Again we had to depend on our flashlights. After a few moments, we all got up and started our way down the trail. We tried not walking too fast but the wind chill was setting in. Ashton's hand entwined with mine, her lips and knuckles had a tint of purple. The type of cold that shakes your bones if you were to stand still. I am mentally exhausted, it's hard for me to concentrate. Ed tried his best to hold a positive attitude the best he could as we walked through the trees. I am sure we didn't go that far down this trail, it has only been a few minutes, but I'm beginning to see the same scenes over and over again. We passed the same log on the right of the trail 4 times now and no one has said anything yet and I do not have the mental capacity to. After 10 more minutes, we rounded a corner to see a tiny flicker, about hip height, off the side of the trail. A whistling could be heard from its origin. It was a man, sitting on a log in snow boots and a ski jacket. He had a clean-shaven face and dim eyes. He was pale, bald, and with a welcoming aura. He was smoking out of a tobacco pipe. Sir, we need your help, we need to get out of here," Kendall said, running up to the man. As we all approached, he began to speak. "Why are we so worked up, my friends? Sit down, smoke with me, take in the beauty of the forest at a time like this," the man said. "Now, what are your names?" he added politely. "I am Kendall, this is my boyfriend Jake. Next to him is Ed. To the left of me is Ashton, then her boyfriend Forrest," Kendall replied as he stood up to shake our hands. He was old school, he kissed the hands of the women and sternly spoke with the men. He had an aura to him that was very humble, very calm. We all lit our cigarettes and passed around the whiskey. The man built a fire pit out of rocks off of the trail, under a tall tree. It was nice to sit by the fire and get our warmth back. "I didn't catch your name, sir," I said as I handed him the whiskey. "My name is Jim," he said, taking a swig from the bottle. Ashton looked at me with her eyes wide. We both tried our best to hide our anxiousness. He looked over at me, then at Ashton before looking back down at the bottle. "You know, fear would have killed you out here. Fear drives people to do things they normally wouldn't. You don't need to fear the forest. If you are lost, build a fire and wait for the morning, do not spend time on it if you can't control it," he added. "Can you take us to the road?" Ashton asked. "Of course I can," he said with a smile. He got up and told us to walk a little up trail while he put out the fire. After about 15 feet we stopped and waited for him. We could hear the water hitting the ground followed by a sizzle from the fire. I turned around to find him pissing on the flames. For the first time since we've been out here, we were beginning to smile again. I was still very cautious of Jim, but right now, he is our only way out. Eventually, he zipped up his pants and walked towards us using a long branch as a cane. He had no flashlight, he had no map. We started back down the trail following the same path we were on before. This time we were making progress. The wind was growing even stronger, the snow was coming down even harder. Ashton began to tear up due to the pain the wind chill caused. We all took turns asking him questions. This was a strategy we learned in camp to keep our brain occupied. We rounded another corner. The fog was thicker in this part of the forest. We could barely see him in front of us. We walked for a few more minutes before we realized that we could not find Jim. After calling out to him a few times, we figured he walked too far ahead of us. We could not find him anywhere. We stood in front of very large boulders, about 20 feet tall, that sat about 15 feet off the narrow trail. The large boulders were hidden by the tall pine trees. We all called out to him. We tried over and over but no one was answering. With every minute passing, we felt more hopeless and more lost. The longer we sat still, the more the cold affected our ability to function quickly and effectively. We tried lighting our Zippos but the wind kept us from keeping a good flame. "I'm not dying here, Forrest," Ashton said, shivering as I held her. "Neither am. We will get out of this," I said, hugging her as tight as I could to keep us warm. Our faces grew pale, Our lips were purple and numb. We were numb. There was a break in the wind that lasted a few minutes. It was enough to warm up a little before the next gust came through the hills. Ed and I tried to get a fire going. Kendall had to pee, so Jake and her went behind the rocks. A few moments later, Jake and Kendall came running back with life in their voices. "Guys, come here. Come here." We followed them to the other side of the large boulders. On the other side, next to a spot of pee, facing south, was what looked like a big foxhole. One of the abnormal things about it is that the hole went under the rock, and the border of the semicircle was cobblestone. The hole was maybe 5 feet long and 3 feet wide. A cold breeze could be felt from the hole. I got on my knees and shined a light inside. "It looks hollow, man," I said, standing up. I threw a rock inside to see if I could hear anybody speak up. "I don't think it's occupied," Ed said. "Okay, who's going first?" Jake asked. "Wait, hold on, do you see that?" Ashton said, shining her light about 10 feet above the hole. A stone slab was pressed into the boulder. The slab read, "Lasciate ogni speranza, voi centrate." "Abandon all hope for ye who enter here," Ed said, staring up at the slab. "How fucking cliché is that?" Jake said as he began laughing. We all kind of chuckled. Ed volunteered to go in first, followed by Kendall, then Ashton. We dropped down a few feet into the hole. The floor was uneven at first but descended down into a more level area. It was like a giant open room with dirt walls and a stone ceiling. Like somehow the giant boulders above us are the roof. The floor was dry, the air was still. Roots from the trees made their way into the cavity we were standing in. Some protruding from the walls were the perfect height to sit on. Having flashlights made it too bright in a space like this, so we took candles from Ashton's backpack and lit them one by one. They worked perfectly. We found a sock, a flannel, and an old brim hat on the floor. It almost felt like someone found shelter here. The wind howled past the opening we entered through. The glow from the night sky lightly illumined the wall and floor underneath. It was considerably warmer down here. We caught our breath and talked for a little while. We were growing calmer now that we felt safe. We passed around the whiskey while some of us smoked cigarettes. "Did you hear that?" Jake shined his light on the wall to the right of us. We saw another opening. This one looked about the same size as the first one. Not one of us really talked about it. We all kind of just grabbed our backpacks and made our way over the hole. We brought our lights up to the narrow pathway. It looked like it went gradually down too. Ed picked up a rock and threw it into the narrow opening. We concluded that there is another open area at the end of the crawl space. We are going to have to take our packs off and tie them around our leg. When we crawl through, they should be fine dragging behind us until we reach the other end. I said as I took my backpack off. "He'll go first," Jake said. He crawled through the opening on his stomach head first, holding his candle in front of him, while dragging his pack. Kendall followed after, then Ed, then Ashton, and then me.